Hello and welcome to Mendoza Reacts to PMQs. Here we are for another week of Prime Minister's Questions, where we cut through the nonsense. Let's have at it.
We now can Right Honourable Sir Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition.
Right, here we go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I too celebrate the birthday of the NHS, as we all will, this Sunday, particularly at this time? Mr. Speaker, at the daily press conference on the 18th of June, the Health Secretary said there's an outbreak of COVID-19 right now in parts of Leicester. Yet it was only on Monday evening this week that the government introduced restrictions. That's a delay of 11 days, during which the virus was spreading in Leicester. Why was the government so slow to act?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, the government first took notice and acted on what was going on in Leicester on the 8th of June, because we could see that there was an issue there.
What did you do though?
We sent mobile testing units, formal mobile testing units shortly thereafter. We engaged actively with the authorities in Leicester, with public health in Leicester, with everybody responsible in Leicester, in a way that we've done with other areas that have had similar issues. Unfortunately, in Leicester, it did not prove possible to get the results that we've seen elsewhere. So on Monday, we took the decision which I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman approves of, to go into lockdown in Leicester, because I've been absolutely clear with the House and with the country that we are going forward. We've made huge progress, but where necessary, we will put on the brakes. We acted decisively, and I think it was the right thing to do.
Keir Starmer.
Pause. Okay, that was nonsense.
Mr. Speaker, I do support the government's decision of Monday, but I think the 4,000 businesses and the 160 schools that are now shut might take some persuading that the government acted quickly enough. One of the problems in Leicester was the local authority only had half of the data. They had data for Pillar 1 COVID tests. That's NHS, care workers and tests in hospitals. They didn't have Pillar 2 tests, the wider tests in the community. Now, that may sound technical, but what that meant was that the local authority thought there were 80 positive tests in the last fortnight, when the real figure was 944. The local authority was only given the real figure last Thursday. So there was a lost week whilst the virus was spreading. There are now real fears, Mr. Speaker, of further local lockdowns across the country. Can the Prime Minister give a cast-iron guarantee today that no other local authority will ever be put in that position again?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid the...
Pause. Okay, before we go over to Boris Johnson, who is probably simply going to lie about this, let's have a look at the facts. So, what Keir Starmer is talking about is that journalists at the Financial Times have uncovered that whereby in Wales, when they're reporting the number of tests done, where they're reporting the number of people that have been tested under Pillar 1, which is, as Keir said, but there is also Pillar 2, which are commercial tests, so these are tests that are happening in the wider community. Now, that first pillar, the sort of the NHS tests, they are only about 10% of the total tests. The Pillar 2 is 90% of the total tests. So when you're looking at those numbers that they're reporting about the number of new positive cases, you're only seeing 10% of the total picture of people who have actually tested positive for the virus. But it's not only you that's not seeing that, it's also local government and local health authorities, which of course absolutely need this information if they're going to be able to attempt to act fast and notice a peak. Let's take a look at an incredible Twitter thread by the journalist John Byrne-Murdoch, and here he is expanding on the Financial Times report. So he says the UK government's published numbers of new cases at local authority level only include Pillar 1 and not Pillar 2 cases, meaning as many as 90% of new cases are missing from the data. He continues, there's a lot of concern about an uptick in infections in Leicester over the last few days, with the city now going back into lockdown. But here's what you see if you look at the government's published data on new cases in Leicester. As you can see, and John says, What new outbreak? You look at that picture, it looks like it's going down, right? It looks like Leicester's got everything under control because they're only showing Pillar 1. But the government is sitting on a much more complete data set, including Pillar 2, which tells a completely different story. More than 90% of new cases in Leicester are now under Pillar 2, yet these numbers are not public. If you're a local business owner in Leicester, you only see the blue. Now look at the difference. This is a growing issue, with Pillar 2 tests catching an ever larger share of new cases. 2 months ago, most cases were found under Pillar 1, so not publishing Pillar 2 wasn't a huge deal. Today, Pillar 2 is more than 80% of new cases, i.e. the public is being shown only 17% of new cases. It's a particularly big problem in the East Midlands and in Yorkshire and the Humber, where Pillar 2 accounts for the highest share of new tests and cases. The public, MPs and councils in these areas are only seeing a tiny share of new cases, risking being blindsided by a second wave. To reiterate, the government's own local authority cases dashboard shows woefully incomplete data, amounting to less than 5% of new cases in some areas. This is not flagged anywhere on the page. You have to go to a separate page to see it buried in the notes, and even there, the extent of the undercount is not stated, nor are its implications. Several websites have built tools to help people see how many new infections are in their area, and they all use this junk data. I don't blame the websites, I blame the publication of data that is incomplete to the point of being unusable, with caveats buried on another page. Full Pillar 1 and 2 data is being shared with local public health bodies, so some health officials know what's going on in different bits of the country. But this data is not shared with local councils, mayors, MPs who've had to ask for it and wait weeks. Useless in fast-moving pandemic. The rest of the public, whether it's school governors, local business owners or journalists writing about the presence or absence of new outbreaks, are being fed data that is ultimately garbage, and the people publishing that data know it. As of this weekend, England's lockdown effectively ends, with the reopening of pubs and restaurants, social distancing being reduced to a metre. There's no compulsion for people to wear masks when they're out and about in public. Essentially what's happening here is that Boris Johnson is repeating the same mistakes in England that led to the 65,000 deaths that have already occurred because of the coronavirus crisis. We are going to have a situation where people are moving about, transmitting the virus. We're not in any way able to monitor the spread of that virus or act anywhere near quick enough to prevent a second wave. So let's see what Boris's response to that was.
That honourable gentleman is mistaken, because both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 data have been shared not just with Leicester but with all authorities, Mr Speaker, across the country. And we did in Leicester exactly what we did, for instance, Mr Speaker, in Kirklees or in Bradford or in Weston-super-Mare or other places where very effective whack-a-mole strategies have been put in place.
Fuck off with your whack-a-mole.
For reasons that I think the House will probably understand, there were particular problems in Leicester in implementing the advice and getting people to understand what was necessary to do. But let's face it, we've had...
Pause. Okay. Notice what he said there. The implication being that there was something unique about Leicester and it had nothing to do with government incompetence or the deliberate withholding of critical data. Because apparently people in Leicester didn't understand. Why wouldn't the people of Leicester not understand? So this is what we call dog whistle racism. We are seeing a growing trend amongst Conservative MPs to begin to shift the narrative on the disproportionate impact on BAME communities of coronavirus. So currently black people are 4 times as likely as white people to die of coronavirus in England. Asian ethnic minorities are twice as likely to die from coronavirus as white people. And this isn't some sort of genetic predisposition or condition. This is mostly about the sort of structural racism in our society that means from housing to the job opportunities to the way people are treated in work. All those things add up that mean it's more likely for these groups of people to catch coronavirus in the first place and less likely for them to survive if and when they do. But this narrative is being now shifted to begin to imply, quite gently in some cases, more heavily in others, that rather than being the victims of coronavirus, people of colour are in fact super spreaders. And you will see this if you go into the darkest depths of the right-wing internet. You will see this as an open conversation and accusation that's being put forward. And that's bad enough. But it's now coming from elected representatives. Boris Johnson is hinting at it here, and he knows exactly the audience that he is talking to. Those words might sound like nothing to you, but imagine listening to this from point of view of someone who believes that the reason Leicester has now had this coronavirus outbreak is directly linked to the fact that it also has a high BAME population. And here is Andrew Bridgen this week talking about the same issue.
We know that, as you've mentioned, we've got a much bigger Indian subcontinent community in Leicester. Tends to be multi-generational households. So you've got the younger people going out, mixing, perhaps coming back home with no symptoms, and then grandma and granddad going to hospital. We've also got quite a big food industry in Leicester, which are vital workers, and they've worked throughout the lockdown, so there's more chance of transmission there because they've not been stopping at home. And also, there is a garment industry in Leicester which should have locked down, which has worked for internet retailers throughout the lockdown, and I think that's a major contribution to the reason why we've got this problem now in Leicester.
How could you listen to that report and not infer from it that the real issue here is the black and brown people? He's basically turning victims into perpetrators. So not only are we not worthy of help or support, but actually there needs to be some sort of action taken against us. It's absolutely disgusting.
To act, the government has acted, and he wants to know whether we'll act in future, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we protect the health of the entire country. And I can tell him that we will. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker.
No, we won't.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the Mayor of Leicester this morning, and I know the Prime Minister spoke to him yesterday, and it's absolutely clear that he didn't get that data till last Thursday. I doubt he told the Prime Minister something different yesterday. The Prime Minister can't just bat away challenge. These are matters of life and death and the people's livelihoods. An example of this, Mr. Speaker, last week, the member for Hove asked the Prime Minister, how can seaside towns be expected to cope with likely influx of visitors to beaches and parks during the hot weather? The Prime Minister replied, show some guts. 2 days later, Bournemouth Beach was closed with 500,000 visitors. A major incident was declared. Does the Prime Minister now regret being so flippant?
Prime Minister.
I really think that the right honourable gentleman does not distinguish himself by his question, because I was making it absolutely clear that as we go forward with our plan, our cautious plan.
What is cautious about this plan?
For opening up the economy, it is very, very important that people who do represent seaside communities, places where UK tourists will want to go, should be as welcoming as they can possibly be. That was the message I think is important to set out. But it is also vital that people have to behave responsibly. Yeah. And that is why the scenes in Bournemouth were completely unacceptable, and that is why we stick to the advice that we have given. And I made it absolutely clear that people, if they're going to travel to the seaside, if they're going to take advantage of the easing of the lockdown, then they must observe social distancing, and it is everybody's responsibility to ensure that is the case.
Yeah. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Nowhere else in our society do we say that critical rules, the upholding of which are the difference between life and death, are just left up to common sense? Do we do that with murder? Do we do that with manslaughter? Do we do that with fraud? Do we do that with rape? No, because we know there will always be people who break these rules. And these are and far fewer people are going to break a law to kill someone or rape someone than just to go to the beach on a Saturday. So it's completely absurd to suggest that with no intervention from the government at all, magically on the hottest day of the year, after being told it's okay to go to the beach, everyone is going to stay at home. It's just... Honestly, sometimes you've got to wonder if these people just don't want us all dead, because Boris Johnson is not a stupid man. And I think a lot of the stuff that him and Dominic Cummings are doing at the moment is almost weaponising the worst aspects of human nature and then blaming the people, knowing what the likely result is, rather than their primary concern being to protect human life and prevent a public health crisis and the subsequent economic crisis that is gathering pace as we sit here right now. This is just not leadership at all.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must understand why this is of such concern. There's nationwide lifting of restrictions this weekend without an app, without clear data for local authorities, or the world-beating system we were promised. Last week, I do support it, but I'm not blind. I support the easing of restrictions, but unlike the Prime Minister, I'm not blind to the risks. And I don't think anybody else should be. Two-thirds.
Why are you booing?
Last week, I pointed out to the Prime Minister that two-thirds of people with COVID-19 are not being reached and asked to provide their contact details. The Prime Minister typically said it was all a stunning success. The updated figures now show that things have got worse. Of the 22,000 new cases of COVID infections per week in mid-June, just 5,000 were reached and asked to provide details. So now three-quarters of people with COVID-19 are not being reached. How did the Prime Minister explain that?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows very well, a test, track and trace operation is actually reaching huge numbers of people and causing them to self-isolate in ways I don't think he conceivably could have expected a month ago when this system was set up. It has now reached 113,000 contacts, 113,000 contacts who have undertaken to self-isolate to stop the disease spreading.
No, I'm sorry. Shut up. This is absolutely outrageous. So first of all, the information they're publishing in England about the number of people testing positive is missing 90% of the people who are testing positive. Now we find out that their test and trace system, which is, remember, we've gone over this every week. This is a system which means when someone is identified as testing positive for coronavirus, basically you hoover up all of their contacts. Who have they seen over the last 10 days, 2 weeks? Then you go and contact those people and you get them tested. And the idea is then you suppress that cluster. Those people all go into isolation. The virus can't move beyond the bounds of that hopefully small cluster of people. But the point is you needed an app to go alongside that, because how is someone going to have all the contact details for everyone they brushed past on the beach in Bournemouth last weekend? Or everyone on a train that they travelled on, or a bus? That's not likely. So that's the reason that they wanted this app, so that you could effectively kind of monitor people, find out who was in the same space at the same time, and use that as the basis for your reports. But they're doing neither. So currently the total number of people being contacted is only a quarter of the people who are potentially infected. So you're missing 90% of the people who've proven positive and 3/4 of the most likely newly infected cases. And when asked to defend it, all Boris Johnson can do is say, well, this is what we are doing. But there is no answer to why he is not doing the other pieces of this work, or any accountability for the impact of not doing that work successfully. And before anyone chimes in with, oh, it's complicated, yes, it is complicated, but Britain is one of the leading nations of the earth. And many other nations with a fraction of the GDP and infrastructure of the United Kingdom are nailing this. They are nailing it. This is not even a matter of resources. It's not a matter of infrastructure. It's not a matter of having the expertise within our shores. This is purely a political decision. This government is choosing to kneecap the United Kingdom's response to coronavirus.
And that is why we're now seeing the number of diseases, the number of new infections come down for several days running now to below 1,000. The number of deaths continues to come down. And that is a great achievement on the part of the entire population and their willingness to support test and trace.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister can't see that if 3/4 of those with COVID-19 are not being contacted and asked for their own contacts, that is a real gap in the system. You can't just brush it away by referencing those that are contacted. It's a real problem and it's growing and it's going to have to be addressed. The Prime Minister did this at phase 1, brushing away serious concerns. I want to turn to the Prime Minister's speech yesterday, if I may, Mr. Speaker. Amid the normal bluster, there was a really striking line in that speech. The Prime Minister said, "We know that the jobs many people had in January are not coming back." I fear that this is the equivalent line to the line in the Prime Minister's speech of March the 12th, when he said, "I must level with you. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time." And we know what happened next. That's why there needs to be a laser-like focus on protecting jobs. So how many jobs does the Prime Minister think yesterday's announcement will protect?
None.
Mr. Speaker, I think he first of all might pay tribute to the work of this government in protecting 11 million jobs throughout this crisis. He might draw attention to the fact that we've supported huge sectors of the UK economy at a cost of £120 billion. And I'm not going to give a figure for the number of job losses that may or may not take place, but of course the risk is very, very serious, as he rightly says. But that is why we're proceeding with the new deal, the fair deal for the British people, which will be not just massive investment in our National Health Service, £34 billion in our NHS, £14 billion more into our schools, but an investment in infrastructure going up to £100 billion. That we are going to build, and deliver jobs for the people of this country.
Pause. Sorry, Keir, we're going to come back to you in a second, because I just wanted to go over this new deal. So Boris Johnson gave this big speech this week about how he was launching this Rooseveltian New Deal. And for those of you without sort of a forensic knowledge of US history, it was President Roosevelt who in 1933 in the United States launched the New Deal, which was the United States' response to ending the Great Depression. And it was basically an almost unprecedented level of investment in infrastructure, public services, welfare, housing, jobs, the whole lot. It was absolutely enormous. And at the moment, what the government is what they're explicitly saying, they're calling it the New Deal. They're calling it Rooseveltian. They're trying to imply that their response to coronavirus and the subsequent economic crisis that it is going to bring in is equivalent to that move by President Roosevelt in 1933. But I went and did some digging about this, and I found a fantastic blog written by the Institute for Government. They've gone through that New Deal with a fine-tooth comb, and I just wanted to tease out some of the critical points for you so that you understand just how much bullshit Boris Johnson just uttered in that Prime Minister's questions. So this is by Thomas Pope. It was written on the 30th of June this year, so that's yesterday, the day before I'm recording this message, the day before this edition of Prime Minister's Question Time. So firstly, what Thomas Pope points out is that much of these announced spends are simply re-announcements of existing projects that the government hasn't done yet. So it's nothing new. They've already failed to do this for 10 years, and they're now simply re-announcing them as if they were the response to the coronavirus crisis. So the obvious question is, if they haven't already done this in the past 10 years, why would they do it now? So next, Thomas looks at what is the government's plan for stimulating the recovery, and he says, well, Johnson's infrastructure announcements in particular are targeted at boosting the UK's long-term productivity, but the more immediate recovery phase of the COVID crisis is likely to need a different set of economic policies to stimulate it. Other countries, such as Germany and France, have already announced stimulus policies, but Boris Johnson's speech didn't do that. Instead, the Prime Minister's pointed to the Chancellor's speech next week, promising that the immediate plan to support the economy through the recovery phase would be set out then. So despite this being billed as the Prime Minister's big speech on the economy, we're left waiting another week and for another minister to answer arguably the most pressing economic concerns. So even though Boris Johnson is selling this thing up, we still have no detail. And when pressed on it, he's just saying us, well, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is going to tell you next week, so calm down. And three, we've got, and this pertains directly to Keir Starmer's question, how much difference will these plans really make to jobs? Well, Thomas Pope says, with the government having subsidised the wages of some 9 million employees and replaced the income of 2 million self-employed people through the coronavirus shutdown, it's no surprise that jobs are a major concern for the government as the economy reopens. But little was offered about how the government plans to support jobs. The only new policy specifically targeted at creating employment was the announcement of a scheme to guarantee work to those entering the labour force. And while extra public spending on infrastructure will create some jobs, the construction sector makes up only 6% of the UK economy and 7% of UK employment. Even an expansion of construction activity larger than that announced today could not support that many additional jobs. Furthermore, workers currently in sectors that seem most precarious, hospitality, leisure, tourism and retail, are unlikely to have the skills to easily take up new jobs in construction. So the point is, if someone's losing their job at Debenhams, they're not going to be able to become a structural engineer on a bridge within any short time frame. They're going to have to go and retrain. There's no mention of investment in that retraining of people to move them from sectors that are dying into sectors that we can promote and boost. So all of the support measures that you would have to have around a plan like this basically don't yet exist. And this is the kicker for me. So FDR's new, so that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt's New Deal is estimated to have amounted to a gigantic 40% of US GDP. So when Franklin Roosevelt unveiled his New Deal, the investment was equivalent to 40%, nearly half of the GDP of the United States. That is an enormous sum of money. The statisticians have added up all of Boris Johnson's promises, and what do they add up to? They add up to 1% of UK GDP. 1. There is just no way on earth you can call this an equivalent response when it is literally 1/40th of the size of the response proportionally. And so I think it's really important for you guys to have that background, have that working knowledge of what these proposals by Boris Johnson actually are. In this case, many of them, the majority of them, are simply re-announcements of money that had already been committed before, that was already deemed inadequate before. The projects the infrastructure projects that he's calling shovel ready are simply projects that have been promised over the past decade, which have never come to fruition. So, and there's no sense of urgency from the government here that would indicate that suddenly, magically, they're going to start doing this stuff.
The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday was investment equivalent to less than £100 per person across the United Kingdom, 0.2% of GDP. Not much of his announcement was new, and it certainly wasn't much of a deal. Meanwhile, as the Prime Minister was speaking, Airbus announced 1,700 job losses, EasyJet 1,300 job losses, TM Lewin and Harvis 800 job losses. That's just yesterday. And there was nothing in the Prime Minister's speech for the 3.2 million people in hospitality or the 2.9 million in retail. Next week's financial statement could be the last chance to save millions of jobs Will the Prime Minister start now by extending the furlough scheme for those parts of the economy that are still most at risk?
Yeah.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me just repeat and remind the House that overall this package represents a £600 billion package of investment in the UK economy. But the best single thing we can do is get our economy back to health by getting our people back into work and getting the virus defeated and under control. And the best thing actually that the opposition could do is stop equivocating and doing one thing one week and one thing another week this week, and decide that they emphatically support ending the lockdown. They emphatically support kids being back in school rather than being bossed around by the unions. Mr. Speaker, we are the builders, they're the blockers, we're the doers, they're the ditherers. We're going to get on with it and take this country forward.
What a load of old shite. Pause.
Gosh dang it! I am so mad right now!
Do you just look at the flippant response that Boris Johnson just gave there? You would have no idea what the real impact on jobs has been of coronavirus right now, and no sympathy or empathy towards the people who are currently having their lives torn apart. And this is really only a fraction of the impact that we're likely to see. This report from the BBC from a couple of weeks ago says that the number of workers on UK payrolls dived more than 600,000 between March and May. Meanwhile, the number of people claiming work-related benefits, which includes the unemployed, was up 126% to 2.8 million. And if you want an idea of just how many people are going to be affected in October when the furlough scheme ends, we have that too, because separate figures published by the HMRC showed that a total of 9.1 million workers are having their wages paid through the government's furlough scheme. That is more than a quarter of the workforce. So we are sitting on an unemployment time bomb that is going to go off in October. And what Keir Starmer is attempting to do here is push the government, push Boris Johnson to say exactly what the plan is for supporting those people or creating alternative jobs, or what Thomas Pope was talking about with monetary experimentation. So this is looking at schemes like universal basic income. And this is a really great tool to use in situations like we find ourselves in now, where essentially our economy is completely dysfunctional. Our economy is not built to operate in the circumstances it currently finds itself. And you don't have to be a socialist to say that. This system isn't working. And therefore, you have to get really experimental and creative about how you transition the economy into a new way of working that fits the circumstances that you find yourself in without creating a public health crisis, a poverty crisis, an unemployment crisis, all of those things. This is the job of government. It isn't the job of individual companies to manage an entire economy. It's that company's job to make a profit and be good to its own employees. So this is absolutely the government's responsibility to take care of, and they're not doing anything. And that's where we are. Play.
My right honourable friend not share my anger and the frustration of the Scottish tourist sector just as it's getting back on its feet, that it's having the legs pulled out from under it by deeply irresponsible, damaging and divisive talk of arbitrary border closures and quarantining of visitors from across the rest of the United Kingdom.
Pause. Okay, this is a ridiculous question, so this is unnecessarily hostile. The devolved nations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, have had a completely different COVID-19 control response than England, and it's been far more effective. I'll show you some of the figures of that now. And there you can see the relative comparison of deaths. You've still got England right up, kissing nearly 1,000 deaths per day, whereas England, Scotland and Wales are now down well into single digits, and all three nations are experiencing several days in a row with no deaths. England is still up just under 1,000 deaths per day. So you can see it's quite legitimate that countries bordering England, which have seen their new cases plummet, their deaths plummet, and have maintained a much stricter lockdown than England has, are going to have a bit of a problem with English people crossing the borders into their countries without quarantine protections, because there's a high likelihood that those people could be carrying coronavirus. So Scotland has spoken about now potentially making sure that any English people that travel north of the border have to go into a 2-week quarantine, effectively treating it like an international border. These are the same rules that are being applied across Europe, across the world. And so that MP there, that Tory guy there, is now getting really heated and upset that how dare Scotland attempt to protect its own people at the expense of some English people's time? How bloody well dare they? So what did Boris say in response to that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I find the suggestion absolutely astonishing and shameful. There will be no such discussions with the Scottish administration about that. But I would point out to my honourable friend what he knows very well. There is no such thing as a border between England and Scotland.
Oh, really?
Talking of which, we come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Go, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that the thoughts of everyone in the House will be with me and those that were caught up in the terrible incidents in Glasgow last Friday, in particular with PC David White and those that went to do their duty, and we hope that everyone makes a speedy recovery from their injuries.
I can't believe no one mentioned that.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister delivered his self-proclaimed relaunch speech, but when asked what new money will be given to the Scottish Government at the daily press briefing, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson laughed. Laughed, Mr. Speaker. That's what this government thinks about funding for the Scottish economy. Jobs, families and livelihoods. They think it's a joke. Is the Prime Minister capable of answering a direct question? And I don't want the usual waffle. It's a straightforward question. What are the new Barnett consequentials coming to Scotland as a result of yesterday's speech?
None. Wales is also getting none.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think he probably does the spokesman in question a serious injustice, because I think I don't believe that he would have taken this issue anything other than seriously, because it's quite astonishing fact that already. Or he should wait till next week to have the full Barnett consequentials for what we're outlining from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor. But I really do hope that he and all his SNP colleagues go around brandishing the fact that not only has this crisis seen the British Army, the British Armed Services, absolutely indispensable in Scotland and elsewhere.
What has that got to do with anything?
The UK Treasury step up to the plate and get that furlough funding across all 4 parts of our United Kingdom.
It's like the minimum.
It was a massive success, and let me tell them that already the Barnett consequentials amount to £3.8 billion for Scotland.
Going back to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Well, the Prime Minister simply couldn't answer the question, because the question was, what were the Barnett consequentials out of yesterday? And we know, Mr. Speaker, that there was not a single penny for Scotland out of what was supposed to be a reset speech from the Prime Minister yesterday. This was a speech devoid of action, devoid of ambition, and devoid of any support for the most vulnerable in our society. The Prime Minister has set the UK on a 2-tiered recovery. On the same day that he delivered his speech, this Tory government reintroduced its benefit sanction regime after a 3-month freeze. That's not levelling up. It's heartless. It's cruel. It's unnecessary. Will the Prime Minister announce right now that he will keep the freeze on benefit sanctions, or will we have to wait till he's shamed into yet another U-turn?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beseech the Honourable Gentleman, right Honourable Gentleman, just to think that he may be mistaken. The UK government is absolutely dedicated to supporting people of all incomes across this country. That's why we've actually increased spending on benefits by £7 billion with universal credit, and we stand ready to do more. But I can tell him that there will be plenty of wonderful things that we want on to do with him, working with the Scottish administration to improve transport and other infrastructure across the whole of the United Kingdom, including Scotland. So I think I really hope that he will cooperate.
So another week, another long string of nonsense from the Prime Minister. I really hope this video has helped give you some of the facts behind the nonsense. And until the next time, bye-bye.